Nice to see you. Thank you for agreeing to do this. As you see, I'm doing my homework. I have actually read it before and greatly enjoyed it. Alistair, for an apologist for religion, to be able to say that you once were an atheist gives you a certain amount of street cred, which not everybody can boast. Could you tell me a bit about your journey from that position to where you are now?
Well, I think when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, I did feel very strongly that religion was something that caused violence and difficulties. And certainly, I think growing up in Northern Ireland, you can see how easy that would have been to be the case. And back in the 1960s, of course, everybody was a Marxist, and I followed that intellectual fashion. And so it just seemed entirely reasonable to adopt an atheist approach. And of course, at the time, I was studying natural sciences, wanting to go and study chemistry at Oxford. And again, it just seemed to me that the sciences and atheism almost, if you like, rolled into each other in a very intellectually satisfying way. I think when I arrived at Oxford, I began to rethink things. I began to realize they weren't perhaps as straightforward as I thought. And certainly it was at that point that I really began to feel that Christianity offered a better way of seeing things and making sense of things than I'd imagined in the past.
Right, thank you. This is sort of coming to the end of a fairly long period of interviewing people, and in America and in Israel, I've interviewed some fairly, what should we say, odd bedfellows of yours, and I sort of feel I ought to give you the opportunity to say something reasonable, because I've interviewed people who said, I'll believe in evolution when I see a monkey give birth to a man, or I've interviewed somebody who thought that it was right that adulteresses should be stoned to death. I mean, how do you feel about being, in a sense, in the same camp as people like that?
I think any member of a group, whether it's religious or anti-religious, obviously finds themselves in company that they might feel at times rather uneasy about. For example, many atheists would be alarmed at some of the violent ideas you find in other atheists. And I certainly do find myself concerned about some of the more extreme views, some of the more violent views I find amongst religious believers. And certainly I would want to try and emphasize the fact that Christianity is a rational faith, that it certainly believes very strongly in God, but it also believes that we can make sense of the world, and therefore to engage in dialogue with people like you is immensely important, partly because it advances understanding, but also because in principle it is extremely important to be critiqued by people with alternative viewpoints in case we've missed something.
Yes. Well, I've been trying to engage in dialogue and repeatedly was brought up short by the fact that there was no dialogue to be had, because at some point the trump card of faith is produced, and there is no arguing with that. Now, I know that in this book you take me to task for my, as you think, misunderstanding of faith, and I wonder if we could talk about that a bit. I have said that faith is not based upon evidence, but is what you need when there isn't any evidence. And as soon as there's any evidence, then you don't need faith anymore. And you have possibly rightly criticized me for not taking sufficient account of the way Christians have actually defined faith. And I understand that. I understand that the way Christians define faith does not correspond to the way I define faith. However, I don't understand where you're coming from when you do say something like faith is based upon reason. I mean, what kind of reason, what kind of evidence do you use to support your faith?
Well, I think that's a very fair question. And certainly I'd want to say immediately that we're talking about a slightly different situation than, for example, evidence that the moon orbits the Earth at a certain distance. I think that one of the big questions one has when one tries to make sense of anything that is big, for example, what is the meaning of life, why we hear things like that, is that there are many explanations. And inevitably, this means we have to try to do what Gilbert Harman described as infer to the best explanation. In other words, there are many possible ways of explaining this. We have to make that very difficult judgment, which is actually the best of these. And the real difficulty I find, and certainly I appreciate your concern at this point, is that evidence takes us thus far, but then when it comes to deciding between a number of competing explanations, it is extremely difficult to have an evidence-driven argument for those final stages. So what I'd want to say is that I believe faith is rational in the sense that it tries to make the best possible sense of things. But in the end, it has to move beyond that, saying, even though we believe this is the best way of making sense of things, we can't actually prove this is the case. And therefore, although I believe faith is rational in the sense that it gives the best possible case it can give, there is a point at which it goes beyond the evidence. And it's at that point, I think, that your concern that it might be irrational, I think, comes into play.
I suppose I would say that at that point where it goes beyond the evidence, that's when it becomes faith. And before that, it isn't faith at all. It's using evidence in the proper way that evidence should be used.
I think I take your point. I think what I'd want to say is that evidence perhaps leads to some probabilistic judgment. There is a possibility there might be a God. But the question is, how do we actually confirm that? Yeah. And there is a sense in which I think one has to say, in the end, we have to make a decision of some sort. There is none, we can't make a decision, or there is a God. And in the end, I think that means stepping out in a degree of faith, whether that is to say there is no God and we'll act on that basis, or whether we decide there is a God and we'll try and act on that basis.
Right, I'm glad you said. I mean, I quite agree with you. We want to talk probabilities.
Yes.
Neither of us can say with certainty 100% certain 100 or 0% certain. So we do need to talk probabilities. There is a tendency for some people to say...
I'm so sorry. Very sorry. A slight sound point. Camera at speed.
Of course, I totally agree with you. We've got to talk probabilities. Nobody can be certain one way or the other. I think there is a tendency for people to say something like this: you cannot disprove the existence of God. Therefore, that immediately jumps us to 50-50, as though there was some sort of even-Steven probability, simply because you can neither prove nor disprove. Now, I think we'd both agree that we don't want to jump to 50-50, that there are all sorts of probabilities that lie between 0 and 100, and which are not necessarily 50. Now, my attempt to get there is another thing that you've criticized quite strongly, and that is to say that there is an inherent improbability in living things, in the complexity of living things, the statistical improbability of living things. It's something, after all, that creationists from Paley down have played upon. And I want to say exactly the same thing of a designer of any kind, because it seems to me that any entity, any being capable of designing a universe, or an eye, or a knee, would have to be the kind of entity, I don't know in detail of course, but would have to be the kind of entity which would be statistically improbable in the same kind of way as the eye is. You strongly object to that, apparently on the grounds that Christian theologians don't say that. And I accept maybe they don't, but my question is, why don't they?
Well, I think there's some very good points being made here. I mean, certainly I wouldn't say that simply because there is a possibility there may be God and a possibility there may not be God. It's a 50-50 situation. I think that we are in a situation of when we can't actually prove something decisively either way, we do have to try and make a judgment to the best of our abilities and what the probabilities are. But I think we need to say that you can make a probable judgment cognitively. In other words, I think the evidence points this way, but existentially I feel I can commit myself to this. So I think there's a tension between the probabilistic side of things and being able to actually live a life as a response to that. But then you make a good point, which I think is that this therefore raises the question of the extreme improbability of God. And certainly you've made that point well in your writings. I think one of the responses I would want to make, though, would be this. Perhaps God is extremely improbable. I mean, it is very difficult to actually arrive at an agreement on what this might be. But in the end, I think the ultimate question is going to be improbable or probable. The real question is there a God? And I think that is one of the problems I find, that there is a limit to there's a limit to the position to which probabilistic arguments can take us. In that, in one sense, statistically, you and I are very improbable, and yet we're both here having this very interesting conversation. And so in one sense, there is this very difficult judgment about, given the fact that it may be improbable, does that actually mean that this is not the case?
We are indeed very, very